Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take a look at some of my old reviews and update them to my current quality standards. Today we're taking a look at Star Wars Battlefront 2 for PC, PS2, PSP, and Xbox, and of course what you are seeing is the PC version. This is a first or third person shooter depending on which perspective you prefer that was developed by Pandemic Studios and published by LucasArts in 2005, and in addition to being pretty well received overall, it went on to become a hugely successful title and was the last major Battlefront game we saw up until the reboot in 2015. Sure, there were a couple of handheld spin-offs, but those were certainly not Battlefront 3, and the reboot that DICE did is definitely not Battlefront 3 either. So for the time being, I actually consider this the end of the proper Star Wars Battlefront series, because while there was a Battlefront 3 in development, and the leaked footage that we've seen of it actually looked pretty damn good, even for pre-alpha stages, it simply wasn't to be, and what we got with 2015 was a radically different game. But instead of throwing around speculation about what could have been, let's go ahead and take a look at what was, and find out exactly how Battlefront 2 is as a sequel, as well as how it is as a game in general. Well, as far as presentation goes, it is noticeably improved over the original Star Wars Battlefront. You have improved texture work, better modeling, smoother animations, although it's not a huge degree. There is a lot of asset reuse here, it's just that it's been updated. And so you have the maps that you saw in the previous game that have been updated to the graphic standards of Battlefront 2, and you have a bunch of new maps that are thrown in there with a lot of really nice effects. Things like flame effects or other particle effects. The reflections still look rather good. It's got some very nice quality visuals for its time, and those have held up surprisingly well to this day, even though this is over a decade old at this point. That said, there are a few issues here and there with some slightly robotic animations that are just a bit stiff, particularly the sprinting animation that they added in, but it's nothing that really drags the game down horribly, and if you can get past the fact that it's a bit over a decade old at this point, you're not going to have any real issues with the graphics here because, again, they were very high quality for their time. And while we certainly had better looking games at the time, for example Half-Life 2, they didn't have the same engine constraints that this did. For example, on PC, once again, 64 players, which is an awful lot to be able to render some really high-res visuals up until you get more into the modern era. So it's fairly easy to forgive it for those particular graphics issues, and when you get to the sound design, things are just fairly average. It does use the John Williams score once again, so there's not really too much you can say about that other than the fact that the John Williams score is fantastic. But when you get to the sound effects and the voice acting, a lot of it was reused, and while that's not necessarily a bad thing because the sound was decent enough quality in the previous game, it would have been nice if they had actually significantly improved the sound effects and the voice acting as opposed to basically just reusing it. The newer stuff they add into the game is mostly hero voices, and they fit pretty well actually, so they did a very good job with that. But the amount of reuse makes it kind of hard to really judge the sound design other than it's about as good as the original Battlefront, which makes it a bit disappointing that they didn't improve it in the sequel. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and unlike in the previous Battlefront game, the campaign in this actually does have something resembling a story. The idea is that it's told from the perspective of a clone trooper who goes through the events of basically Episode 3 on up through the rise of the Empire up until the Empire Strikes Back with the Battle of Hoth. Although the narration that the clone trooper gives is really just a setup for what is effectively a series of battles that take place in the various maps that you have available to you in the normal game, only instead of being like the normal game modes like you saw in the original Battlefront and just what you see in the multiplayer and everything, this actually has a dedicated campaign with campaign-specific objectives, so you'll have to go retrieve things and bring them back, or you'll have to capture certain points, or destroy certain things, and such like that. They're usually very simple objectives, considering that the engine itself is pretty simple, but it's not simply playing through normal game modes that you would see in the multiplayer and in the instant action and such like that this time around. Instead, it's actual campaign, and while that is greatly appreciated, admittedly the campaign itself itself isn't really that great. The only real story that you get is through the narration, which really isn't all that great, honestly. While they do have decent voice acting to go along with it, the problem is that the actual narration is not really telling you anything new or interesting about the Star Wars universe. It's basically just reiterating things that you would have already known. That said, the campaign itself is a nice addition because it's an actual proper campaign this time around, and more importantly, it gets you pretty well introduced to the actual mechanics of gameplay and gets you used to how everything works out, which is of course useful for both the instant action kind of stuff that you're used to and the Galactic Conquest mode, which has actually been revamped a bit. This time around, you actually have a map that you traverse your fleets on, and you start off with a very, very basic set of soldiers. Namely, you start with the basic infantry and you start with pilots for the space battles, and that's it. You have to unlock everything else via credits that you earn by winning battles, or even actually losing battles, but regardless, you earn credits that you can then spend to unlock these various soldiers, and you can also use these credits to purchase the various power-ups like you saw in the previous Battlefront game where they were just unlocked on a planet-by-planet basis. So the Galactic Conquest mode has more depth this time around, and you can actually engage in both space and land battles. That said, it does get kind of grindy now that you actually have to unlock all of the various soldier classes instead of simply having them all available from the start, so that can be kind of problematic. So even though they did improve the depth with the Galactic Conquest mode, unfortunately it's not quite as good as the original Star Wars Battlefronts mode, simply because of the fact that you have to unlock all these soldiers instead of simply starting with at least the basic loadout, the 4 basic classes that you actually don't need points in order to spawn as. See, that introduces something else that they messed around with regards to the actual gameplay. When you get into game, you will find that the first 4 classes of every single faction are available to you at any time. And those are your basic infantry class, your anti-vehicle class, your sniper, and your engineer class. There are also 2 additional classes that you can unlock as long as you gain points in order to do so, which is kind of an interesting way of doing it. They basically make you start off as a grunt, so to speak, and work your way up to these other classes, which do have some fairly powerful abilities. For example, the Dark Trooper that the Empire got in the original Battlefront is back, and it's modified a bit, but they also have it behind this point-based class system, so you have to earn points in order to actually be able to play as a Dark Trooper. Same thing goes for things like the Wookiee or the Droideka. And really this isn't a problem because you actually just earn these points by doing pretty much whatever you want in-game. As long as you're killing enemies, capturing points, something like that, you're going to earn tons of points. You don't need to worry about it. But this also brings up something else they introduced, which is the concept of heroes. Now, these existed in the original Battlefront, but they were 4 unkillable, unplayable NPC characters that would just run around the battlefield and do all sorts of crazy havoc, people like Luke Skywalker or Darth Vader. In this one, those characters are actually playable now, and there's actually a pretty good variety of them. Things from the Jedi, of course. You see a lot more Jedi in the Clone Wars era stuff, but there's also, of course, Luke Skywalker, the Emperor, Darth Vader, and so on in the Galactic Civil War era, but there's other hero units as well, like, say, Boba Fett or Jango Fett, and these spice up the gameplay pretty considerably because they are ridiculously powerful. Sure, they can be taken down, and in fact, they're not that hard to take down, but if used properly, they can absolutely demolish the basic soldiers that you'll run into, and so you can actually send in basically an infantry push behind a hero unit, and the hero unit can run in and just clean house while the actual soldiers do the rest of the work. And that's kind of interesting, although it can get kind of frustrating if you're on the receiving end of certain heroes like, say, Boba Fett, because he is mostly ranged stuff, and the Jedi are actually some of the easier ones to take down because they are close-range fighters for the most part. But regardless, these are typically earned by getting points, although you can also switch it over to a timer system instead, where it'll just have a timer ticking down to when you can actually use this particular character. But the point version does give you some incentive to play well, and even though it does discourage teamwork to a very slight degree, the way the classes are set up, you still do need to work as a team. Particularly if you're playing on a map that has a lot of vehicles on it, because otherwise you're not actually going to be able to do much of anything. So while the heroes are a nice addition, they they definitely could have used a lot of work to really make them fit in really well with the other stuff that you're working with, particularly considering that the way they work, they actually have a depleting health meter, which is the lightsaber you see at the bottom of the screen whenever I'm got some footage of a hero unit up, and that gradually depletes over time even if you're not actually taking damage. Taking damage accelerates it. The way you replenish it is by actually killing enemies, and so it behooves you to actually just go in and wreck things as opposed to hang back and just kind of camp the spot like in, say, the new Battlefront. So at least they don't break the game quite like the new Battlefront's heroes do. At any rate, the other major addition to Battlefront 2 that was not in Battlefront 1 at all is space battles. Now you can actually go into space and dogfight with other fighters and, of course, attack Star Destroyers and things like that. In fact, during the campaign itself, you will often run into levels that have you playing a space battle right before you actually land on the planet and do some work on the ground, which is pretty cool. But that said, the space battles could have been handled a bit better than they are currently. There's only 3 types of ships. You have your basic fighters, you have troop carriers, and then you have the bombers that you'll be using to destroy the things on the Star Destroyers and such like that. And during this mode, you only have 2 classes available to you. Those are Pilot and Marine. And the Marine is pretty self-explanatory. You land on the enemy's main ship and you just wreck everything in there that you possibly can. The pilots are also pretty self-explanatory. They're basically like the engineer class, only they're specifically for pilots. And so as you're flying around as a pilot, the ship you're in is actually going to gradually replenish its health. But if you're just running around as the pilot and you're getting into a blaster fight, you're probably not going to come out on top because they're actually pretty weak in that regard. They only get a blaster pistol and not much else. But as far as the actual ship controls go, they're not the best, nor are they the worst. You have your arrow keys on the keyboard and mouse that will accelerate or decelerate, and if you do left or right, they will either roll you, or if you double tap, they will actually do some quick maneuvers that are basically there to help you dodge incoming missiles and such. To actually direct your ship and aim at things, you are using the mouse, and it's mostly a functional system. There are some weird issues with the sensitivity on actually turning and such with the mouse, but it is something that you get used to after a while. So piloting the ships might actually be a bit easier if you're using a gamepad than if you're using keyboard and mouse, but it's very playable on keyboard and mouse, and I do just fine for the most part with that. The general objective of the space battles is to, first off, deplete the enemy capital ship's shields, and then start destroying their vital systems, things like the life support, the communications array, the engines, such like that, until finally you actually manage to do enough damage to properly win the battle. You can, of course, also run into the enemy's ship as soon as their shields are down, and you can land in their hangar bay and run in and start just destroying systems internally, which is pretty cool. It means the space battles actually have somewhat of a feeling of combined arms in addition to actually just having the space dogfighting and such. And like pretty much everything else in this game, the space battles themselves are actually rather fun to play through. They're not amazing, but they're fun, and that's what this game is clearly designed to be. It basically takes the original Battlefront, expands on it pretty considerably, adds in the newer version of the Clone Wars from Episode 3, and throws in some new maps, space battles, hero units, a proper campaign, and a revamped Galactic conquest mode. There's actually quite a lot of value in that package, and what you end up with here is a game that basically completely supplants the original Battlefront, especially considering that it does remedy some of the problems that the original Battlefront had. The AI is slightly less horrible. It's barely noticeable really, but it is noticeable. You can now do dodge rolls forward and backward as well as sprint, which is very handy. You have a stamina meter that influences this. The class balancing is slightly better this time around, although it's not really a huge degree. And there are some additional modes that you can play that really do spice up the gameplay experience over the rather limited gameplay experience that was in the original Battlefront. It's ultimately the prime example of something that is great at being an iterative sequel. It doesn't dramatically change the gameplay formula from the previous game. It retains everything that did. It just tweaks a lot of it to make it so much better than the original game that there's really not much reason to play the original game anymore. That said, this still isn't really that amazing of a game. It's good, it's a fun game to play, but there are still some balancing issues and technical problems that they never really managed to sort out, and now that it's about a decade old, they have additional compatibility issues with modern hardware, although it's really not wildly problematic. The main issue I had was a sound glitch that is pretty easily rectified by simply modifying the command line parameter when you try to run the game. It wasn't anything that really broke the game, but it was mildly annoying. And when you go into the menus, they're all rendered in 640 by 480, while the actual gameplay is rendered at a different resolution. For example, mine's at 1080p, and 1080p is natively supported this time around, so that's nice. But ultimately, the problems the game does have aren't enough to sink it. It's just a lot of fun to play. And now that the single player has been revamped so considerably, even the single player is fun to play, which is a good thing because the GameSpy master servers shut down, and so it's kind of a pain to actually get this thing working properly online now. You have to basically go through external means to actually play online. But unlike the original Battlefront, this is actually still available digitally because it still works. It's just that the multiplayer isn't functional anymore. At least not without some filling anyway. And it's kind of a shame because this game really is best played in multiplayer against other players, and so you can actually work as a team against another team that is actually working as a team. Those moments are when the game absolutely shines, but even the single player is still a lot of fun to play. It's not a perfect game, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a well-made game. It's a good sequel, and it's a lot of fun to play, and really the best that the Battlefront series ever got. That said, the people who are constantly raving about it and acting like it's the best thing ever need to tone it down a notch. Really, that's your nostalgia talking. Ultimately, the game is not amazing in itself. It's just a lot of fun to play, and it is a great Star Wars experience, even though mechanically it's just fairly good, which is ultimately why I'm giving it a 3.5 out of 5. It's a good game, it's a lot of fun, but it definitely has some issues, although with the entry price being so low these days, that's not really that much of a problem anymore. Thanks for watching.